Everyone was watching Minnesota, the protests, the ICE operations, the court orders, the breaking news banners that never seemed to end. For weeks, it felt like the entire country was frozen on one story. And that's exactly when something else happened. Because while the cameras stayed locked on Minneapolis, President Donald Trump was quietly making moves that put Canada on notice. Moves that could reshape North American power for decades. I'm Emily Carter, a U.S. political and global affairs analyst, breaking down how power moves beyond the headlines. This isn't a conspiracy. It's not a leak. It's not a secret meeting caught on tape. It's strategy hiding in plain sight. Minnesota deserved attention. Federal operations, legal clashes, tragic shootings, those were serious events. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Media attention is finite. And when it's consumed by one crisis, it creates space elsewhere. Space for decisions, space for leverage, space for pressure. And during that window, Trump turned north. Most Americans still think of Canada as the friendly neighbor, polite, predictable, safe. But in Washington's strategic calculus, Canada has quietly become something else entirely, a vulnerability. And Trump sees vulnerabilities differently than most presidents. By the time January rolled around, the groundwork had already been laid. Tariffs, escalations, signals that barely registered outside trade circles. Then Canada made a move that changed everything. A deal with China. On the surface, it looked routine, but to Trump, it wasn't routine at all. It was a line being crossed. And once that line was crossed, the tone shifted fast. Because what happened next wasn't diplomacy as usual. It was pressure, deliberate, public, and unmistakable, and almost no one was paying attention. From the outside, Canada's move looked technical, a trade adjustment, a diplomatic balancing act, the kind of thing governments do quietly all the time. But in Washington, it landed very differently. By late 2024, Canada had begun expanding economic ties with China, not just symbolic cooperation, but deeper trade engagement in areas the U.S. considers strategically sensitive: energy, supply chains, critical infrastructure. To Canadian officials, it was diversification. To the Trump camp, it was defiance, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The United States had spent years warning allies about over-reliance on China, not just as an economic competitor, but as a strategic challenger. And Canada wasn't just any ally. It was America's largest trading partner, a NATO member, and a central pillar of North American security. That's what made the move stand out. Trump didn't respond with private warnings or diplomatic cables. He went public. Tariffs were floated. Trade pressure was hinted at. Language hardened, not toward Beijing, but toward Ottawa. This mattered, because when a U.S. president applies pressure to an ally instead of an adversary, it sends a signal far beyond trade. It says, alignment is being tested. And Canada suddenly found itself in an unfamiliar position, not as a partner negotiating details, but as a country being evaluated. What made the moment even more revealing was timing. This escalation came while American media attention remained fixed elsewhere: Minnesota, courts, domestic unrest, which meant the shift in tone went largely unnoticed. But inside policy circles, it was unmistakable. The message wasn't just about tariffs or trade deals. It was about leverage. And Trump was making it clear that leverage would be used publicly, not quietly. In part 3, we'll look at how this pressure spilled onto the global stage and why a meeting in Davos became the moment Canada realized this wasn't a temporary dispute. The shift became impossible to ignore at Davos. What usually plays out there is careful language, polite panels, statements designed to calm markets, not move them. But this time, the tone was different. Canadian officials arrived expecting routine conversations about trade stability and global growth. What they encountered instead was pressure, visible, public, and unmistakably political. At Davos, Trump's messaging hardened, not through formal speeches, but through calculated remarks and selective engagement, comments that framed North American trade not as cooperation, but as leverage. And the subtext was clear. Canada's growing economic engagement with China had crossed from diversification into alignment risk. That distinction matters, because once an ally is seen as drifting, the conversation changes. It stops being about policy differences and starts being about trust. Behind closed doors, analysts noted that this wasn't just about China, it was about signaling. Trump was reminding allies that proximity to U.S. power comes with expectations, and that those expectations are enforced, not only through treaties, but through pressure. What made Davos significant was visibility. This wasn't a quiet trade warning. It was a message delivered in front of global investors, heads of state, and economic leaders. Canada was no longer navigating a private disagreement. It was being publicly positioned, and that positioning carried consequences. Markets pay attention to Davos, so do capitals. From that moment on, the story stopped being about a single trade decision. It became about whether Canada could maintain strategic balance or whether balance itself was no longer acceptable. At this point, many analysts began asking a broader question. If a major U.S. ally can face this level of pressure for recalibrating its economic relationships, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Is alignment becoming binary, or is there still room for strategic independence? That's not a simple answer, and it's one worth discussing. In Part 4, we'll look at how Canada responded after Davos and why this moment marked a turning point rather than a temporary flare-up. After Davos, the tone shifted again. But this time, it wasn't coming from Washington. It was coming from Ottawa. Canadian officials began walking a careful line, publicly downplaying tension while quietly reassessing their position. Statements emphasized cooperation. Commitments to North American trade were reaffirmed. Language softened. But behind the scenes, the recalibration was real. Analysts noted that Canada's leadership now faced a strategic dilemma. Pull back too quickly, and it would appear reactive, even submissive. Hold course, and it risked sustained economic pressure from its largest trading partner. Neither option was clean. What made the situation harder was timing. This wasn't happening during a period of global stability. Supply chains were already fragile. Energy markets were sensitive, and geopolitical alignment was becoming more rigid, not less. Canada's China strategy, once framed as pragmatic diversification, was now being interpreted through a different lens, not economics, security, and once a policy question becomes a security question, flexibility disappears. Inside U.S. policy circles, the message was consistent. Allies could trade, they could diversify, but they could not blur strategic lines, especially when it came to China. That expectation wasn't new. What was new was how openly it was being enforced. Canada, long accustomed to quiet negotiation with Washington, now found itself responding to pressure that was both public and sustained. This wasn't a one-off dispute. It was a test of how much strategic independence a close ally could exercise before consequences followed. And by early spring, it was clear that the relationship had entered a new phase, one defined less by assumption and more by alignment. In Part 5, we'll step back and look at what this episode ultimately reveals, not just about Trump or Canada, but about how power is being applied in a world where neutrality is shrinking. When you step back, this wasn't really about Minnesota. And it wasn't only about Canada, it was about how power is applied when attention is elsewhere. Trump didn't announce a new doctrine. He didn't deliver a sweeping speech. He didn't frame this as a historic shift. Instead, he applied pressure quietly, then made it visible at the moment it mattered most. The signal wasn't aimed only at Ottawa. It was aimed at every U.S. ally watching. The message was simple. Economic relationships are no longer neutral. Strategic alignment is no longer optional, and proximity to American power comes with expectations that are enforced, not assumed. Canada felt that pressure first because of geography, trade dependence, and timing. But the implication went far beyond North America. If a close ally can be publicly tested for recalibrating its China strategy, then the margin for independence is narrowing everywhere. This is the environment global politics is moving into. Less ambiguity, less quiet balancing, more visible lines. And while Trump's style made the moment louder, the underlying shift didn't begin with him, nor will it end there. The real question isn't whether this strategy works in the short term. It's what happens when every country is forced to choose more clearly than before. Because once alignment becomes binary, neutrality stops being a shield. It becomes a risk. If you value clear, calm analysis of how power actually moves beyond the headlines, make sure you subscribe. I'm Emily Carter. Thanks for watching.